In our last lesson, we talked about the new inventions of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, the invention of skyscrapers and how that changed the world, transit systems, printing, and how it affected literacy, airplanes, and photography. Now, for today's lesson, we're going to talk probably about the greatest invention that took place in the United States, and that was the invention of the railroads. Our lesson objectives for today is number one, how did railroads unify the country? And our second objective, what were the reasons for the demand of railroad reforms? Keeping that in mind, let's begin our presentation. First, we want to look at the railroads. It made travel more reliable and it made westward expansion possible. You can travel faster, more efficiently. You didn't have to worry about the weather. You didn't have to worry about animals and carts breaking down. You knew that the train was going to head out west and you would get there at a set amount of time. In 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad, a railroad running from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, two different railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Rail Lines, meet in Promontory Point, Utah. And this is the picture of the two railroad lines meeting, and they connected the first transcontinental railroad in the United States. But this brought other concerns, other problems. For example, what time was it? If it was noon in New York, is it noon in, say, Chicago? And how do we decide what is noon? Noon has always been when the sun is directly overhead. So if the sun is directly overhead in New York, is it directly overhead in Chicago at the same time? Well, no. Professor C.F. Dowd proposed that the Earth be divided into 24 different time zones. Um, Great idea. And these time zones are pretty much divided right along these lines of longitude. In 1884, the International Conference took this idea and set this idea of time zones into play for everyone in the world. So every place on the planet has its own separate time zone. The United States would have four time zones: the Eastern Standard Time Zone, Central Time Zone, Mountain Time Zone, and Pacific Time Zone. Um, the next new development in this time period is the growth of railroads. It led to growth of new towns. These railroads would travel into these dusty, no-name towns, and all of a sudden, like a new exit on a freeway, people will bring their business. They will open up new businesses, shops, like we see on even 480 in Tiedemann, and right today, there's new businesses growing all the time. They want to take advantage of the increased traffic. Same thing happened with the railroads as they traveled across the country. Um, each town kind of had the reputation of specializing in its own specialized trade. For example, Pittsburgh became known for producing its steel. New York is specializes in the manufacturing of cloth goods and also shipping, the big shipping docks. Massachusetts deals with their textiles and the clothing industry. Chicago is known for its meat packing, and each city kind of gained their reputation of creating their specialized talent. The problem is railroad corruption. When you have these huge business owners um, owning these railroad companies, they are very powerful and they make a lot of decisions. Looking at this slide over here, we have all the railroads around the 1870s, and obviously you can see there's a lot more railroad lines here in the north than we see here in the south, connecting a lot of these cities: Cleveland, Columbus, Toledo, Detroit, Pittsburgh, and even into Chicago, into to the Midwest. The problem was that when the government gave the land to these railroad companies for them to build their railroads, they expected the railroad companies to then sell the land to the settlers in the territory, in which they could then create their own profits from developing the land, developing businesses along the railroad lines. But the railroad owners realized what 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 a gold mine that they were sitting on when they controlled these railroad lines. So they sold it to their friends as opposed to selling it to the individual settlers. The farmers that were living in the area became very upset. They thought they would have the right to buy this territory and reap the profits themselves. Another problem that the farmers had, the settlers had here in the Midwest, was that the railroad companies agreed to fix the prices for their goods. If you were a friend of the railroad, they would charge you a lower price. If you were an average farmer who wanted to send his goods from, say, Chicago all the way to New York City, you had to pay whatever the railroad companies felt was the right wage to pay, the right price to pay. And it was different, and it wasn't fair. And big businesses helped big business, and it was Joe Q, little guy, that had the problems and always had to pay more to get his goods shipped from one part of the country to another. The farmers got so upset that they formed an organization. They became known as the Grange Farmers. They organized in 1867. What they did was demand that government take control of the railroad industry. But wait a second. What about this term laissez-faire? If we remember back in world history, laissez-faire means leave it alone. Should government leave the railroad businesses to do what they do best, which is make money? Railroad companies thought they should, but the farmers thought that wasn't fair. So the railroad companies began to fight back. Well, the Grange farmers demanded that the government step in and take control. They sponsored state and local candidates to run against these, to create laws that would limit the power of the railroad companies. They pressed for laws to protect the interest and set rates for transporting goods, and these laws became known as the Granger Laws. Now, when the railroad companies were fighting back, they took their case all the way to the Supreme Court, and in the case Munn versus Illinois in 1877, the Supreme Court upheld the Granger Laws, saying that government had the right to regulate railroads for the benefit of the farmers and consumers. Again, this blows up the whole idea of laissez-faire, leave it alone. But if it's for the benefit of the farmers and the average consumers, the Supreme Court ruled that the government should have the right to regulate it for the public interest. So again, this is a very special Supreme Court case. Later in 1887, the U.S. Congress also passes the Interstate Commerce Act, which goes to regulate railroad rates. Only the federal government can regulate interstate trade between one state and another. So the federal government felt that with the Interstate Commerce Act, it could regulate railroads. Now, going back to our objective, how did railroads unify the country? And the second question, what were the reasons that the farmers, the settlers, demanded the government reform the railroads?